So this is a recording of the silver nitrate and copper exploration. So we're going to start with part 1. And step 1 says, label a clean, dry, small beaker with your group and your class. So here's my small beaker. And I'm going to label it. And for this one, I'm just going to say example. Okay, I have labeled my beaker, and now it says find the masses of the copper wire, the test tube of silver nitrate, which is right here, and the small beaker separately, record below in a data table. Okay, so my mass of my copper wire, 0 my balance, and in my data table it says mass copper wire before reaction, so we haven't done the reaction yet. So I'm going to write 1.41 grams in the box because that's what my scale reads. And then I need to mass my test tube with my silver nitrate. So I'm going to place that carefully on top of the balance so that I don't lose any silver nitrate. And that goes in the spot on the data table where it says mass silver nitrate with test tube. So I'm going to write 9.23 grams in that box. And then the last one is mass of empty labeled beaker. So now I have my beaker. I'm going to mass it. And the mass of my beaker is 50.90 grams. Okay. Step 3 says prop up the large empty test tube in a separate large beaker. So new beaker. We're going to prop up the test tube in the beaker. That's really just to hold it. Then it says add approximately 20 milliliters of distilled water to the large test tube. So I have my distilled water and my graduated cylinder. And I'm going to there are my 20 milliliters of distilled water. I'm going to add that to my test tube. Then I'm going to put my test tube back in the beaker. Okay, so step 5 says add the silver nitrate from the small test tube to the large test tube containing the distilled water. So there's my silver nitrate, and I'm going to add it to my test tube with water. Step 6 says stir with stir rod to dissolve. So I'm going to check really quick, make sure I got it all out. I got all the silver nitrate out. Stir with stir rod to dissolve. So I'm stirring carefully. I don't want to poke a hole in the bottom of my test tube. And it looks like it's all dissolved, so I'm going to put it back in there. And then step 7 says rinse stir rod with a small amount of distilled water into the test tube. There we go, rinsed into the test tube. Now I'm going to be really careful because silver nitrate is going to stain my skin, so I'm going to be careful not to get any of that on my hands. So we're on to step 8. Step 8 says coil the copper wire around a pen or pencil. So I have my pencil. And I'm just going to wrap it around my pencil. Take it off my pencil. And then it says stretch wire until it is approximately 2 centimeters longer than the test tube. I don't know. There we go. So it sticks out a little bit at the top. That way I'll be able to grab it. And then, so that was step 9. Step 10 says place wire in test tube with silver nitrate solution. Do not move wire once it is in solution. So I'm going to put my copper wire in my test tube, and I'm going to let it sit. Now, step 11 says to observe the reaction. So I'm going to observe it. And I'm noticing that the copper wire seems to start to turn black. That's what it looks like. And a little bit gray towards the bottom. So we're going to let that sit, and the directions say to let the reaction proceed for 30 minutes. And while we're doing that, it says to mask the now empty small test tube, record below. So here is my original small test tube. I'm going to mass it again. And that goes in the spot mass of empty small test tube, and I'm going to write 8.04 grams, or 8.03, sorry. So right now, my data table shows that I have 1.41 grams of copper, and 9.23 grams is the mass of the silver nitrate with the test tube. The test tube itself has a mass of 8.03 grams, and the empty labeled beaker is 50.90 grams. So as I'm observing my reaction again, I'm seeing that it's turning black at the top, and I'm seeing kind of bluish, greenish crystals at the bottom. So we're going to let this happen for 30 minutes, and then we're going to come back and we're going to look at it. Okay, so the 30 minutes are up. So now we're on step 14, and step 14 says after 30 minutes, gently shake the copper wire to remove the crystals and remove wire from test tube. So I'm going to gently shake my copper wire, and all my crystals, pretty much all my crystals fell off. And I'm going to remove the wire from the test tube. And then it says use distilled water to rinse the wire into the small labeled beaker. So I have my small labeled beaker, and I'm going to rinse my wire just to make sure that I got all the crystals off. Okay, and then I'm going to set my copper wire to the side. And then step 16 says pour contents of large test tube into small labeled beaker. Rinse large test tube with distilled water. Pour rinse water into small labeled beaker. So I'm basically trying to get all of these crystals from the test tube into this beaker. So I'm going to pour everything in. And then I'm going to rinse it just a little bit. Maybe a little bit more. And pour all of that into my small labeled beaker. Okay, now my step 17 says dip wire into beaker with acetone and set aside to dry. So I have my beaker of acetone, and I'm going to bend my wire, because remember, changing the shape isn't going to change the mass of my wire, which is what I'm really concerned about. So I'm going to bend it just so that it will stick in the acetone better. So I'm going to rinse it in the acetone, get it nice and clean. Okay, and then I'm going to set it aside so that it will dry. Now I'm done with my acetone. When the copper wire is dry, find its final mass, record below. Now I'm going to wait for this to dry. Should be a minute or two. In the time being, I'm going to move on to step 20, which says carefully decant the solution from the crystals into another beaker. So I have another beaker. I don't care if it's clean or not, because I'm just decanting. I'm just pouring the liquid in here. And the liquid isn't what we're caring about. We're caring about the crystals. So I'm going to carefully pour all of my solution. Trying really hard not to lose the crystals that were formed. And then Step 20 says rinse the crystals with about 10 milliliters of distilled water. I'm just going to estimate that's about 10 milliliters. And I'm going to stir with my stir rod, get them nice and clean. Set my stir rod to the side, and I'm going to let those sit for a second so that the crystals can settle to the bottom of the beaker. I'm going to check my copper wire. My copper wire is nice and dry now. That's one of the perks of using acetone. Acetone makes things dry faster. So I'm going to put my copper wire on my balance, and my copper wire has a mass of 1.20 grams. So I added that to my data table. So 1.20 grams is the mass of my copper wire after the reaction. So that was step 18. Step 19 says dispose of the wire in a trash can. So it is disposed of. So I am back down to step 22. After the crystals settle to the bottom of the beaker, decant again. So I'm going to pour off the liquid that's in there, trying not to lose crystals. You'll lose some, but that's okay. And it says discard rinse water in the sink. Since my beaker isn't getting very full, I'm going to wait until the end to do that. Oh, sorry, I skipped a step. Step 23 says repeat 3 more times. So I'm going to rinse, stir, let it settle. I'm going to decant. So that was 1. Rinse and stir, and I'm going to let it settle. Then decant. That was 2. And then 1 more time, we'll make 3. So I'm going to rinse, and then stir, and then I'm going to let it settle. And then I'll decant. So I have left a beaker with crystals in it, and I'm going to discard this beaker in the sink. So that's step 24. Then I'm going to put this in the fume hood so I can dry the crystals before I mask them again. And then I'm going to return all of my materials to where they belong in the room. So now that my crystals are dry, I'm going to move on to part 2, or day 2 in the lab. It says find the mass of the beaker with the dry crystals. So I have my beaker with my dry crystals in it, and I'm going to mass it. And the mass says it is 51.58 grams. So I'm going to add that to my data table. So my data table is now complete. That should be an indication that I'm close to finishing up the lab. Step 2 says scrape the crystals into the product beaker at the front of the room, and then wash the beaker, remove the label, and hang on a drying rack to dry. So now I'm going to move on and do my calculations for this lab using the data that I have in my data table.